What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and today we're back with another episode of Can You Cloak It? The series made by rogues, for rogues, to show you exactly what you can cheese or mitigate with the Cloak of Shadows defensive in every Shadowlands dungeon. This series is still a bit of a work in progress, so there are some changes I'll be making with this one, and I'll be elaborating on that in just a bit. For today's dungeon, though, we'll be looking at everybody's favorite, most bestest dungeon ever, Plaguefall. Okay, that's probably not even slightly true, as I'm sure most people would rather eat like an entire Graku's mincemeat fruitcake than do this dungeon ever again, except the fact that they really want their Phial of Putrefaction, or they need to finish it for Keystone Master. Either way, we'll be looking at exactly what we can use Cloak of Shadows for in this slimy, really grody dungeon, and there are quite a lot of things, so stay tuned. As always, this video will be segmented out so you can skim through or refresh your memory on any of these little bits of info, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask below, or you can swing by my community Discord to ask and chat with myself and other folks in the community. The link for that will be in the description below. Now, this Can You Cloak It series that I just started is in its early stages, obviously, so I'm still working out some things that it'll include, but thanks to a couple awesome suggestions in the comments from the last one, I decided to use a color-coded ranking system for when I'm talking about abilities. I ended up repeating myself a lot more often than I wanted to, which happens a lot in most of my videos, but especially in that Necrotic Wake episode. So I'll do my best to try and limit repetition, and instead I'll be using these 3 Bandit's Guile icons, which is probably the most use they'll have in the entirety of the Shadowlands expansion, because Blizzard ruined my favorite legendary. Anyways, anything with the green icon is going to be considered a non-issue or something you should rarely ever feel the need to cloak off. Usually something that's very avoidable that you should be avoiding in the first place, but yeah. Yellow is for things that can be situationally necessary and often just helps to mitigate a decent amount of damage or a low priority mechanic. Red will be for things that are extremely useful to cloak, whether it be to avoid a huge amount of damage or mainly because it will let you cheese a mechanic really easily by doing so. Again, this is still a work in progress, so feel free to mention any other nifty uses of cloak that I potentially have missed. I'll also try to mention here and there things that can be vanished, although vanish is very situational since often if you vanish a mechanic, it'll just reapply the mechanic to someone else. And while that's kind of funny and it lets you troll people a bit, it's not often the best use for vanish. Now that the explanation has been explained, let's begin working through some of the more noteworthy trash we'll be dealing with before the first boss. Plaguefall has a metric ton of disease effects and nature damage, with basically all of it being cloakable. For most pulls I've seen, this big chungus right here at the beginning will be one of the first things you end up pulling. The decayed flesh giant will frequently spawn toxic pools on the ground, though you should do your best to avoid these when possible. A lot of our fungal friends at the beginning will deal nature damage as well, with the largest AoE move being Fungus Storm from the aptly named Fungi Stormers. While you can save your own skin with Cloak against this AoE burst damage, you'd be better off using Gouge or Blind or Kidney Shot to stop this Mushroom Mayhem from damaging the entire group. The Pestilent Harvesters will cast Hurl Spores at players, dealing nature damage on the initial hit and then putting a heavy 12-second dot that ticks every 2 seconds, which is also nature damage. This disease will also slow the player by 50% while the dot is active. Their other, more avoidable move is Doom Shroom. This will spawn a Mushroom of Doom that slowly grows in size over about 7 or so seconds. There will be a green smear on the ground that shows the radius of the mushroom's explosion, and any players in this green area upon detonation will take a pretty sizable chunk of nature damage. Moving into the first boss's room, we have a whole horde of gushing slimes. These things are the worst, because they usually have every mythic plus affix possible, so they cause explosives, spawn spitefuls, drop sanguine, bolster each other. Yeah, these suckers are really annoying. They will also have the gushing slime AoE damage effect. This causes any players within 10 yards to take nature damage every second, so just keep that in mind if it's a bolstering week and you end up with a bunch of heavily bolstered slimes doing AoE nature damage. They'll also drop putrid bile puddles if the slime-coated buff is not dispelled from them before death, so watch your step around these because there are so many of those that your healer's probably not going to waste that much mana or time dispelling them all. And probably bring some wet wipies or something, it's really gross. The Plague Belchers will, surprise, use Belch Plague, which causes a nature damage AoE frontal cone effect that you really shouldn't have much issue just getting out of the way of, but yeah. Now onto the first boss, Globgrog. His Plague Stomp ability deals physical damage, but it does apply a disease called Debilitating Plague. This is a disease effect that will slow your movement by 30%, deal nature damage every 2 seconds, and it lasts for 20 seconds. His other main move, Slime Wave, is a hard-hitting frontal cone effect of nature damage, and if you're hit by this, you take a ton of nature damage every second for 6 seconds on top of the initial hit. Oh, and it roots you for that 6 seconds too. Again, this should be avoided, but if you do get clipped by this and survive it, you can remove the dot and the root, or you can preemptively cloak to avoid all of it if for whatever reason you really don't want to just get out of the way of the frontal cone. Now we're on our way to Doctor Ickus. There are still tons of other cheesable damaging effects along the way, so let's go through those next. Rotting Slime Claws have the Corroded Claws ability, which does hefty nature damage and reduces all your stats by 5% for 30 seconds. Hopefully the tank is holding aggro and not taking a dirt nap, as you should never see this move hitting you. The Blighted Spinebreaker is another enemy with a nature damage frontal cone, lovingly called Festering Belch. Ew. This deals a pretty heavy amount of nature damage and will knock back all people who get hit with it. Plague Binders are your standard caster enemy, and will mainly spam Pestilence Bolt. This does a modest amount of nature damage to a single target. Gripping Infection is their other cast, which will deal nature damage every 2 seconds for a total of 6 seconds, and you'll be rooted during it. If needed, Cloak can get you out of this route, though I would suggest using Vanish instead if you really want your mobility back. This is also a magic debuff and can be dispelled as needed. Rot Marrow Slimes are pretty annoying for 2 reasons. They will frequently cast Corrosive Gunk, which is a disease that deals nature damage every second for 15 seconds. What's worse is that this can stack, so if you're fighting multiple of them, which you often are, or if multiple casts get off, which often do, you can have a very hard-hitting dot on you if you end up getting multiple stacks. This will also leave a putrid bile puddle on the ground if their slime-coated buff isn't dispelled, just like the other slimes earlier in the dungeon, so be careful on your positioning. For more slimy goodness, we have the Congealed Slime. These were those purple ones that were from those ketchup bottles from back in the 90s, and they're super pissed that nobody ever wanted to buy purple ketchup and were left in a warehouse for like 20 years, so now they have a really annoying debuff called Withering Filth. This will put a purple circle around a player, and after a few seconds this will deal nature damage and reduce the haste of all players within that circle by 45%. That haste debuff lasts for a whopping 30 seconds, so this is a very annoying debuff to have. The rigged Plague Borers, those little bug things with a bomb strapped to them, will of course have the Plague Bomb ability that does pretty hefty nature damage to anyone caught in the blast, and they also have the annoying slow from Wretched Phlegm. Did I mention how gross this dungeon is? Anyways, this will deal a pretty high amount of nature damage and will slow you by 65% for 6 seconds, which can be very unfortunate to have hit you right when that Plague Bomb is going off. At the end of the rigged Plague Borer gauntlet is Virilax Blightweaver. He'll spam the usual Pestilence Bolt like all the other casters have, but will also have the Wasting Blight ability and Obliterating Ooze. Wasting Blight randomly targets a couple players, dealing nature damage and reducing haste by 50% for 8 seconds. Obliterating Ooze is that huge circle of green that shows up around him, which does a ton of nature damage to anyone caught in the blast. While this normally shouldn't happen, if for whatever reason you are slowed by one of those rigged Plague Borers and you can't get out of it, then this would be a very good time to use Cloak of Shadows, because it hits really hard. For Doctor Ickus, there are a few uses of Cloak, though none are terribly life-changing. The Slime Injection cast will do a big nature damage hit up front, then cause ticking nature damage that can stack. This is dispellable, so hopefully your healer will get it before you need to, otherwise cloak away. Ickus will spawn a Congealed Slime during the encounter as well, which works just like the one I mentioned earlier with that Withering Filth debuff. That big X pattern of green slime when Ickus starts jumping around, oozing Outbreak, does a pretty hefty amount of nature damage, though should be avoided pretty easily. Between Ickus and the next boss, Domina Venomblade, there are no new trash enemies, though there are some that we've come across that I've already mentioned in this video that you can use Cloak for. As for Domina herself, her brood assassins will constantly throw a hail of daggers at players while they remain hidden within their webs. This move, Assassinate, does a pretty decent chunk of nature damage on the initial hit, but what's worse is the stacking dot that it applies to you. This can get out of hand very quickly if your group isn't fast at revealing the brood assassins. The Shadow Ambush stun effect can also be immuned with Cloak if you want, though you still need to move away from people so they aren't in your circle when the cast goes off, or they'll be stunned and hit with shadow damage. Our last add in Plaguefall for new stuff is Ichor Bileflesh, and while he has a lot of health and an army of undead minions at his disposal, his only relevant move is Pestilence Bolt. Very underwhelming. For Margrave Stradama, she has a number of moves we can mitigate or flat out ignore. Infectious Rain is a pretty heavy disease damage over time effect that happens on a regular basis, which can be a big help for your healer if you remove yours, that way they can keep up with everybody else's. Or if you're really forgetful and somehow are about to get smacked by one of those huge tentacles, you can cloak that as well. This actually is quite handy if you're trying to get a battle res cast off, or you just want to say screw you to mechanics for whatever reason, because you're a rogue and screw you mechanics. Plaguefall is a doozy of a dungeon, with tons of diseases, poisons, and some magic effects that can be either mitigated or cheesed entirely with Cloak of Shadows. Though a ranking system that you'll see on all of these is still a work in progress, as there are some situations where you might need to use Cloak on something that I don't recommend, or don't recommend as often as something else. And at higher difficulties, some abilities hit way harder than they do at say like a 12 or a 13 versus an 18, so you might find that the rules change a little bit depending on the situation. I hope you found this information useful and entertaining. If so, then please consider leaving a comment, a like, or sharing this video with other sneaky boys out there, as that all helps immensely with the channel's growth and is greatly appreciated. As always, I just wanted to extend my gratitude to my regular viewers, commenters, subscribers, and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.